present to the grandchildren, and because they really want to know about the Bowie family and their heritage. And I thought the best way to do that would be to go ahead and take a video cassette recording of it.
Well, I think it's a wonderful idea, except that I'm not a very good subject.
Well, you're a great subject.
I don't mean
You've got all
looking at. I mean, you know, if I were just, if you were asking me questions and all, I could answer them. But to pull stuff out of the.
Well, I am going to ask you questions.
All right.
I'm going to ask you all sorts of good questions. You know, like.
We'll start out.
Yeah, like. Tell us about your mother and your father. I don't even know where they were born, where they came from.
Oh, really?
No. And the girls don't either.
Well, I've given you so much material.
I know, but
and you've got the Bowie book, and you've got the.
But all they have are names, you know. But you know a lot about their life. You know, like grandfather was a meteorologist.
Yeah.
And I think he went to school in
St. John's Academy at Annapolis. He graduated there.
You see, that doesn't show up in any of those slips that we have.
Oh, yes, it does. In the books, it does.
Well,
maybe not.
I don't think so. See, that's the kind of information that they would be looking for. That's the kind of information.
And then he got an honorary degree from St. John's.
What for?
Just because of his
government service?
His not only the military service, but the service in the meteorological. He was world renowned as a meteorologist.
How did he happen to get into that?
As a weatherman.
Yeah, but how did he happen to pick that as a field, you know?
Well, he left home. He had trouble with his father. And there was great misunderstanding. And he left and went south. He didn't know where he was going. I don't know whether he knew where he was going to get a job, but he went to Montgomery, Alabama, and was taken into the Weather Bureau, got a job in the Weather Bureau. And the man that gave him his job was Uncle Wilfred, Uncle Wilfred Wilson, and he was the chief meteorologist down there, and he had married my mother's sister, Aunt Winnie, and they introduced my mother to my father down there.
Where was this?
What?
Where was this?
Montgomery, Alabama. And then she had come down from the farm in Illinois, Lighthouse, Illinois. This isn't taping, is it?
Oh, no, we're just doing a little practice right now.
Her father had come from the northeastern states. All the family came from New Hampshire and Vermont and Connecticut. And his health broke. He had married my grandmother out there. His health broke, and I don't know what he had, but he couldn't use his eyes. And they moved out to Illinois, and he bought this farm and began farming, and he had to finish his studies. He was studying to be a minister in the Methodist Church. And so my grandmother did all of the reading for him. She would sit there and read everything out of books to him. And he got his education, finished his education that way with grandmother's help. And then the children began, and then he started his own little church there, a little Methodist church. And he was the Methodist minister for that large area out there. And became a very prosperous farmer, as well as head of the church. And he had always told everybody never to leave the clothesline up in the yard after dark. And he was a heavy man, and he came in one night at dusk on his horse. He rode everywhere. He never walked, he rode. And he rode into the yard, and one of the family had failed to take the clothesline down, and it caught him at the chest line and dragged him backward onto the ground from the height of the horse. And after that he had pneumonia and died. It killed him. And so after that, that was after I was born. That was, he christened me in September 1898. And it was right after that that he was died, after he had his accident. So it was after my mother had married, you see,
right,
that happened.
And this was your mother's father?
My mother's father. His name was Alonzo Perry Hatch. And he married Clara Lavinia McKinstry, and my name is Helen McKinstry. And what should I tell you? Well, anyway, my father met my mother and fell in love with her down in Montgomery, Alabama. They married, and he was sent up to Memphis, Tennessee, and they went up there. And then from there he was sent up to Dubuque, Iowa, where I was born. And they were each, I think they were the same age. I think they were both born in 1874. I'm not sure about that. My father could have been a little older than that, a year older, but I'm not sure. And then from, you want to hear about my father?
Yeah, I like to.
And so, well, then after Dubuque, he was sent down. They had the Galveston flood. I think it was the worst flood that they'd ever had. And the present forecaster down there had failed to forecast correctly and warn Galveston of what could happen, and it was a hurricane. And so the people did not evacuate. And I think that storm was in 1902. The storm brought the water in from the ocean, and that didn't do the damage. The damage was caused when the wind stopped and they swept everything out to sea. People and houses and everything. It just cleaned the island off. And so it was, the man was discharged and was not kept in the service, I don't think. I'm not sure about that. But my father was sent down there to replace him. And he was very popular. Your grandfather was so much like you. I mean, he just attracted people. He had a certain magnetism about him, always. And so he did such a good job down there as a young forecaster. They sent him up to St. Louis in charge of the Weather Bureau in St. Louis. And my sister Margaret was born in St. Louis then. And from St. Louis, he really loved St. Louis. He knew all the businessmen and everybody, just like your father too. You know, it was just into everything. Just they called him the weather bird, and every day in the paper there would be a little picture of a little bird, one of these caricatures of a bird, and it was Bowie, Edward Bowie, the weather bird. And then he would give the forecast up there. And he made very strong friends there. So from St. Louis, he was sent to Washington, D.C. And that's where I was raised, right here. I started being raised, you see, in St. Louis. I started school there. And
Well, you also had part of the Hash family was down in 76, Missouri.
well, it was while he was in St. Louis that my uncle, Uncle George, would ask us up to his farm at 76, so that he was close. My mother felt close to him. It was sort of like a father figure. He was that much older than my mother, and she depended a great deal on him. And so then we came to Washington, D.C. And what should I tell you? What else should I tell you?
Well, where did you live in Washington?
They bought a house on 28th, 26th, 27th Street, right near the hotel down there where you stay often. Not the Shoreham, but the one, not,
Kennedy Warren? By that?
no, down near the Shoreham, but across the street from the Shoreham. All the way to Woodley Road.
Yeah, that's a Hilton now.
Well, but it's got another name. It's the Wardman building.
Wardman Park. Used to be the Wardman Park.
Yeah, it used to be Wardman Park.
And they lived in the Wardman Park?
No, that was undeveloped woods.
Oh, I see.
Just nothing but woodland. And then our street and Garfield Street and Cathedral Avenue were the few streets there, right across from the zoo, you see.
Mm-hmm. Is that house still there?
And the house is a row house there, yes. There was nothing built in front of us except this. We had this row house and we had everything to play in, just the whole countryside. And it was just a block off of Connecticut Avenue. And it was, then I went to the Eaton School. The Eaton School is one of the nicer schools down there. And it was right up Cathedral Avenue. About, I guess, I don't know how many blocks, 8 blocks in Cleveland Park. So that's where I went to school until I graduated from the 8th grade. I ought to tell them about the grandfather, about Louis.
Well, why don't you start with him?
Well, Louis was born, let's see, Louis' mother was Julia Watkins, and her father was Louis Watkins, for whom Louis was named, Louis Watkins Prentiss. And his wife died when her last baby was born, and so the family was raised by Aunt Em. Her name was Emily Evans, I think. And that was grandfather's sister. I think, or maybe it was a sister. It was a sister of grandmother's mother that raised them. She raised Aunt Alice, Aunt Catherine, and Aunt Lou, Uncle Sam, and and grandmother, who was Julia Watkins. And he worked in the post office, Louis Watkins. And I just gave Catherine a lot of duplicate, what do you call these, photographic copies of his death and his life and his service in the post office down there. He was quite elderly when he died, and they kept him on until he was nearly, maybe he was 80, before they retired him, which is something very unusual. And so when he died, and Catherine came to live with Mother Prentiss and Father Prentiss. I'm all mixed up. I mean, I'm just rambling. This is very hard for me.
Well, so we just.
Um,
I think it's, you know, I follow you completely.
well, Julia Watkins married William Clark Prentiss, and he was a patent attorney. And he did a lot of traveling for different companies. And one of them was situated out in the West, that mining interests. And every time he would go out there to do their work in the different areas, the mining areas, he'd come back with presents for his children. And your father was about 3 years old. And every time he'd come back, he'd bring him an Indian papoose doll. And the third time he brought a doll back to him, your father said, "I was tired of Indian babies."
And he used that expression
I
all
was
his life.
tired of Indian babies. Well, I thought that was so cute.
And he used that expression all his life.
Yeah.
Anytime he got
I
tired.
know it.
Anytime
I
he
was
got bored
tired
with
of
something.
Indian babies.
Anytime he got bored with something.
That expression of Jesus Christ, Miss Agnes.
Yeah.
I love to hear him say that, but it was very shocking.
And oh my, what a warm day.
Oh, you know what that came from?
Well, tell me about that.
You don't know that?
I think it's
I
a
have
record.
told you that,
I
haven't
think
I?
it's a record, as I think.
It was a record that they had, the grandfather Prentiss had in his library, and it was about a Philadelphia family. And they were talking about the summer. My, that was a warm day. And the perspiration from her drowned her poor little children in the parlor below. My, that was a warm day.
And he used to use that
Huh?
and he used to use that expression all the time.
My, that was a warm
Yeah.
day.
Yeah. And if somebody didn't know that story, they wouldn't understand what he's talking about.
No, absolutely not. You have to give it a little background. And then he was just about that same age, and he was having difficulty being housebroken, trained. And he came in one day, and there was a wet spot on the front of his trousers. And his mother said, "Oh, Louis." And he said, "Don't worry, it's just perspiration." I thought that was such a cute thing. Don't worry, it's just perspiration. Wasn't that cute? And he was such a cute looking little boy with a head full of white curls just all over and blue eyes. He was just beautiful. And
Where did they live?
Huh?
Where did they live? Where did they live?
They lived at 1720 Oregon Avenue, and it's still down there. And Oregon Avenue is now Swan Street. And it's being reclaimed. There were 3-story brick houses, row houses. And it was owned by by grandfather Prentiss's father. And he was a pharmacist, a doctor and a pharmacist. And he owned a drugstore in Washington, down near DuPont Circle. I think that's right. And one day he came home. His wife had died, and that's why Grandfather Prentiss and grandmother took the house and raised their children there, and kept the grandfather there to give him a home because he owned the place. And to go back a little bit, on this same property there was a little house on the property that your grandfather Prentiss took grandmother Prentiss when they were married, and they lived there until Margaret was born. Margaret was born in that little house. Then it was after that that the the mother-in-law died, so they moved into the big house to take care of the grandfather. So he came home one time and just said, I sold the business. And your grandfather, Prentiss, was so upset, terribly upset, just to think that he would just throw up the sponge and quit. But he did. He didn't want to do it anymore. And he was a very, very stubborn old man. And one time, Mother Prentiss had a cook, and she had a laundress, and then she had a little girl that helped them wait on the table. Well, on certain days they didn't work, which was a Thursday. So Mother Prentiss was getting the dinner, and she had baked potatoes. And I think she had a lot of difficulty with the old man, because he was getting irascible. And he came out in the kitchen and asked if he could help, I guess. And she said, the baked potatoes are in the oven, put them in a bowl and take them to the table. And I think he was there. There were just the three of them there that night. I think the children had gone. And he said he didn't need a bowl. So he took the potatoes and started for the dining room. And they got hotter and hotter, and he began juggling them. And he juggled the potatoes all the way in and threw them on the table. And Mother Prentiss thought that was so funny. He couldn't be told a thing. You tell him to do something, no, that isn't what he was going to do. So he had the hot potatoes in his hand, and he had to get to the dining room in a hurry.
Was Pop born at that address?
Huh?
Was Pop born at that address?
He was born in that house. Mm-hmm. He was the second child. I think Mother Prentiss had a couple of miscarriages around that time too, but she ended up having the three children, and Clark was just about a year and a half younger than Lou. And every time they would ask Clark if he could do something, he said, no, but my brother can. My brother can. They were just so cute together. She always dressed them in sailor suits with big boots, big black ties, these sailor collars, and they dressed alike. They were almost twins. And they both had curls, but Louis were tighter. I've got to go to the bathroom.
There we go. Now, where do you want your tea put?
Right on the edge of the table.
Okay, I'll move the table over.
It won't show on the picture, will it?
No.
Because it doesn't look too good. Now, you know, I've got to get this thing arranged differently so that we don't see that white thing at the back.
No, I'll tell you what I'll do. Yeah, that's right. Now we'll just go ahead and move in closer like I see.
That's not right. This thing is in reverse and it bothers me. I can't tell. Oh, I feel awful.
What are you doing?
I feel rotten.
There. How's that?
I look terrible.
No, you don't. There's your tea.
What?
There's your tea.
Thanks.
You know, Pop used to tell a story
What?
about the time that he and Clark rode on their bicycles down towards the Capitol.
Yeah.
Do you know that story?
Well, they hit the tar, didn't they?
Yeah.
And
Brand new bicycle.
I know it. And he skidded and slid right across the whole road in the tar.
Yeah, where was that? Do you know?
Where was it?
Yeah.
And Clark wasn't with him.
Oh.
He was alone. It was down there near the Capitol. I don't know what street. And he never told me that. Did I ever tell you what Clark and St. Clair did? Well, they were two hellions if there ever were. It was after Margaret married Ben, and Ben his mother was widowed, and she was having a hard time with St. Clair because St. Clair was the youngest and he was rebelling. And he was the same age as Clark, and Father Prentiss had this car, and they were just at the age when they could drive, and they went down to that Q Street Bridge with the buffaloes on them, and they and some other boys painted the testicles on the on the buffaloes, bright red. It was the most shocking thing in Washington.
They didn't get caught?
No, they just did it. It was around Halloween.
Yeah, but they didn't get caught.
No. And I don't think they ever knew that Clark was one of them. But Father Prentiss was having a hard time with him. And they drove right through one of those circles. Instead of going around the circle, they went right straight on through.
What kind of car was that?
I think it was could it have been an Oldsmobile?
Yeah.
At that time. It was before 1920. I think it was an Oldsmobile that he had. And when it was time for me to be married that night, the night of December the 28th, Mother Prentiss was always ahead of time, ready to go, and the car was out. It was snowing. It had been snowing, deep snow everywhere, and the wedding was at 8 o'clock, and she was so afraid she was going to be late. So they went out to get in the car, and he couldn't get the car started. And Mother Prentiss nearly died. There wasn't anybody to call for help. I don't think he could even he was so nervous he couldn't even get the key in the lock. Well, they finally got out there in time for the wedding because Mother Prentiss had started. But to hear her talk about trying to get that car started, it was pathetic.
Where'd you meet Pop?
Well, I was going to the University of Wisconsin, Madison, Wisconsin, and everybody had canoes up there, and I persuaded my mother and father to let me buy a canoe. It had a hole in it and it had a big patch, but it was a canoe. And you see, Madison is surrounded by lakes: Monona, Mendoza, Waubesa, Kegonsa, and Windgra. And I learned right away, you had to learn the lakes that surrounded Madison. So they gave me a canoe, and I stayed for summer school. And my mother was always crazy to go back to school, wanted to learn more always. So she came up and rented rooms in the same place that I had a room, and brought Suzanne. Suzanne was 4 years old, I think, or maybe 4 years old, so that my mother could take some courses. And she got somebody to take care of Suzanne in the meantime. So we stayed there for the summer school, and then came back and saw Niagara Falls and came on down. And my father had been left with Margaret, my sister. And he didn't know what to do with Margaret because she was so lonesome and didn't have friends. So he would take her out to the Bannockburn Golf Club out here just on the edge of the district line along Western Avenue. All of that area was Bannockburn. It was an old farm. And he taught her how to play golf. And Louis was home from school then, and I think he had some kind of a summer job, or maybe not. I don't think he was working. And he was out there playing golf, and your father could spot a golf ball anywhere, no matter what. And Margaret and I went over to play tennis. And he came back from playing golf, and he had been dating Margaret. And he said hi, and walked over to the tennis court and said, "Do you want some golf balls?" And Margaret said yes, she would. And he took his bag and he held it upside down, and the balls just went, covered the tennis court. Never saw so many balls in your life. And she introduced him to me. So he said, was she going to be home that night? Could he come over and see her? And she said yes, because she was crazy about him. She was 4 years younger than Lou, but was quite thrilled. She was in high school to have a college boy ask her for a date. And my father and Mr. Prentiss were close friends out there. They played golf all the time together. So that night, Louis came out to see Margaret. And we lived in Chevy Chase on what they called Keokuk Street. And it was just a block east of Connecticut Avenue. And my mother, I had a friend, Josephine Bedinger, and I had asked Joe to come out that night. So my mother came to me and she said, "I don't want you to go on the porch tonight. Margaret has a date with Louis Prentiss, and I don't want you to go out there." So I said, "Well, sure." I didn't make any difference to me. And I had a ukulele that I brought back from college, and I could play the ukulele, and I had all these ditties that I could sing. And Josephine was there, and we sat on the couch, and we were playing the ukulele and singing the ditties, and not even thinking about Margaret out on the porch. And Josephine was older than I. Pretty soon Margaret came in, and she said, "For heaven's sakes, come on out and help me entertain Louis." My mother had said, "Don't go on the porch." So I didn't go on the porch, but Louis came on in with Margaret, and we had a piano there, and Louis could play the piano, and I could play the ukulele, and we were singing and having a wonderful time. And when he said goodnight that night, he asked me if he could have a date the next night. And I said, "Sure." And my mother was very angry. But Louis came out, and he had a little car, his father's car, and he took me riding all around the basin, down there, all around there. And so he brought me home, and the next night he asked me for a date the next night, and I said, yeah. And so it got to be that he was coming out at noon to play golf with me, and then he'd come back at night and take me for a ride in the car. He didn't have any money, so we just either took a ride in the car or we took walks. And in 2 weeks, he asked me to marry him. 2 weeks. And I came up that night to my mother, and she was barely speaking to me. And I said, "Louis asked me to marry him." And she said, "Well, what did you tell him?" I said, "Yes." It was the most unheard of thing in my life. I couldn't imagine that anybody would want to marry me. And I just said, "Yeah, sure." Just like that. I thought he was awfully cute. I thought he was wonderful and all that, but as far as being madly in love with him, I wasn't, because I hadn't known him long enough. But I knew that I liked to be with him. And I can remember the first time we were driving down around the basin, and he reached over and he put his hand on my hand. And that was the first time he ever touched me. And then when he asked me to marry him, just like that, I couldn't get over it. I couldn't get I was just laughing, and my mother couldn't help it. She couldn't help it. She thought it was wonderful too. She wanted to get rid of me. So he went back to college, and he left me with a little ring that was just had the seal of the SAE seal on it, and his pin, his fraternity pin. And so that fall, Allison Miller began asking me for dates, and I didn't care for him, but he was a lot older than I. I was 21 and he was 31, about 10 years old. And he had a lot of money, and he had a Bearcat Stutz, a red Bearcat Stutz. And I was going around Washington in that bear Stutz. Every time he'd come out, he'd take me out, and then he would take me out to dinner up in the mountains, Sugarloaf Mountain, and places that I'd never been. I'd never had anything like that. I'd never gone to hotels for dinner and things like that. And Louis was coming home for Christmas, and I told Allison wanted a date with me, and I said I couldn't have a date with him because I had a friend coming to see me, and he kept asking me the name, and finally I said it was Louise. I didn't want to tell him that I was going to see another boy. It was Louise. Well, we could get somebody for Louise. I said, I don't think so. And anyway, I went out with Louis, and Allison knew I was going to be at this dance down on Church Street, and he came in there and he saw me with Louis. But Louis went back to school, and then Allison began dating me really hard. And I don't think you want to hear all this.
Yeah, I do. I've never heard anything like that.
Well, I got so upset and so nervous because my mother could see that it was a wonderful chance to marry money. And she was all for pushing it. And my father wasn't sure. And Allison was about 5'6" and sort of 5 by 5. He was rotund, and he was getting bald. And he could do anything because he had all the money in the world. But I just couldn't see him. But I was having a wonderful time going to dancing, but I didn't like to dance with him. But I know one time he even bought a diamond ring that was the biggest diamond I ever saw. It was pear-shaped, and he had it designed himself. This beautiful diamond, and he had horseshoes in little diamonds on each side. And just the fact that that had horseshoes on, I tell you, I can't tell you how I felt. It wasn't, I couldn't wear horseshoes, but this beautiful pair of diamonds. But I didn't know what diamonds cost. And he gave it to me, and I put it on my finger the next day and showed it to Margaret, and Margaret said, "I think you're crazy." And it jacked me right up on my heels that she could say that. And my father asked me to go down to the office with him. He was in the forecasting business, you know. He was in the weather bureau down there near Columbia Hospital for Women. And he asked me to, he had to make the forecast at night. And he asked me to go down with him. He wanted to talk to me, but he couldn't talk to me. And I had the strangest feeling. I couldn't talk to him. I knew he wanted to talk about Allison, but he couldn't do it. And he couldn't draw it out of me. And so in about a week, Allison asked me to go down to this hotel that I was telling you about. What is the name of that?
The Wardman Park.
Wardman Park. For dinner and dancing. And he asked my mother. I didn't know why. So my mother went with us on this date. And she didn't dance, but he danced. And that night, when we came home, she said, I know you can't marry Allison. I could tell it. I didn't want to be touched by him. I didn't know it showed, but I didn't want to be touched by him. And so I got, he was pushing me so hard, and I began to think I was going to have a nervous breakdown because I was throbbing in my neck all the time. I didn't know what to do. And I knew that everybody in Washington knew that I was out in Allison's Bearcats. So one day, I asked him to drop me off at Father Prentiss's, at the Prentiss's house. And he left me there. And I had called up and asked Mother Prentiss if I could talk to Father Prentiss, because Louis had written that he didn't think that his father was going to send him the money to come home. And it was coming up June, and I didn't know what to do. Here I was. I know what they were thinking, but they didn't know what I was thinking of inside. And so he took me up in his library alone, and I talked to him, and I asked him if Louis was coming home, that I had to know. I had to know. And I was very upset. I didn't cry or anything, but he could tell I was nervous. And he always did like me. When Louis first brought me home, he was shaving up in his bedroom, and he just had on his shirt and suspenders and trousers, and he was in front of a chiffonier, and he had his shaving mug and all, and he was shaving up there at night. And I felt so embarrassed at being taken into his bedroom. But we were going to a dance, and I know I looked well. And his eyes just sparkled when Louis introduced me to him. He really did like me. So when I met him in his library, and I asked him about Lou, we waited a little while, and then he said, I'll send for him. And so we all went down to the station, and Louis came home. Because I think they had told Louis that I was dating. Where, have you lost it with somebody? Come on, wake up.
Come on, let's go walk. Come on.
Go on.
Come on.
Everybody out.
Ollie oxen.
Go on, go on. Hurry up. So he came in at night, and I knew then I hadn't made a mistake. I don't know why I'm telling you all this.
Because we want to hear it.
Oh, it's just my romantic time.
Yeah. I think that's a real nice love story, don't you?
Well, it was my whole life was a love story with your father. He really was. He was the only man in my whole life. And that's why it was so hard for me when he suddenly, instead of being a husband to me, I was his mother.
When you started to
And
fail.
I couldn't take that.
When you started to fail.
Mhm.
Yeah.
I couldn't take it. He just wanted me for a mother. Needed protection and shelter and care. So, that's my life.
Oh no, we got lots.
Hmm?
You got married.
Oh yes, that was a beautiful wedding.
Down here on Connecticut Avenue?
Cathedral, just off of Connecticut at All Souls Memorial Church. And the afternoon of my wedding, I was always pressing everything. I couldn't wear anything twice unless it was pressed. And our house had basement stairs that went down, turned on the landing, and then went down again, and they were stairs that just had, what do you call them, lifts, with no backs, just lifts. And the ironing board was underneath the stairs. And I decided that my wedding veil needed ironing, pressing, and it was borrowed. A neighbor of my mother's loaned it to me, and it was a complete circle of the most beautiful tulle that she had had in her wedding when she was married in New Orleans, and it was just the most exquisite thing, and I was going to wear that. And I took it down the basement, and I was pressing it, when the man that my mother hired to come out and wash windows had a bucket of all of his water that he'd been washing windows with Bon Ami in it, and he tripped, and the bucket and all in it went down the steps, and here I was underneath the steps, and the veil underneath it too.
Was this your wedding day?
My wedding day. I grabbed it, but all the water had come down. And then I went tearing up to my mother to tell her what happened. She was fit to kill me. She wanted to kill me. But what we did was, it was tulle. She held it up and she dried it and she kept shaking it, and all the Bon Ami fell out of it. But honestly, I've never seen my mother so angry in my life. But I wore the veil. And that's what you see in my wedding picture up there.
With the Bon Ami and all.
Well, it shook out, but I guess there's still some in it. And then Dr. Sterrett, who was about 80 or 82, who had started that little church, All Souls, and Cousin Sue's husband, which was my grandmother's cousin. Cousin Sue was grandmother's cousin. She married the Reverend Dr. George Williamson Smith, who was the rector at St. John's, but not the active rector. What do you call it when they are the head, but they don't? They have to have a helping hand. He and Dr. Sterrett, these two old men, married me, and they were so beautiful up there. Dr. Sterrett was very Scotch, and he had white chops. What do you call them?
Sideburns.
Side chops.
Yep. Mutton chops.
Mutton chop. He had mutton chops, curly mutton chops, and white. And Dr. Smith, George Williamson Smith, was even older than he, and both of them needed help. But they tied the knot for me, and I thought it was so beautiful. And I wanted candles on the altar, and the church was so a low church, and they did not believe in candles and things like that the high church did. And Dr. Sterrett had said nothing like that was going to be in his church. But Mother went to him. My mother went to him, said that Helen wanted some candles on the altar, and I had candles on the altar.
Well, where'd you go on your honeymoon?
Went up to New York and stayed in the Algonquin Hotel.
In what, New York City?
Uh-huh. I had never been to New York. So we went down, the wedding was at 8, and the reception was at home. And then Louis in his uniform, and his saber, and his spurs. And we went down to Union Station, and all the young people followed us that we had in the wedding. And Marie Dowell and her date drove us in her father's car. And they were trying to get away from these cars that were following us. And this was around 11 o'clock at night. And I think Marie was driving. And Louis and I sat in the back. She went the wrong way around every circle, trying to get away from them. She went on wrong way streets. She had, I can't tell you what she did. She finally ended up at Union Station at this wild ride that we had, and she got 27, what do you call them, tickets the next day.
Citations.
Citations. 27. Everything was, I never saw anything like it. She was the craziest girl. But we went down there and they all caught up with us, and we got on the train and we went to New York that night. And let's see. We called up Louis' cousins. Aunt Hannah lived in Elizabeth, New Jersey, and they asked us to come over to Elizabeth for dinner from New York, and Louis didn't know how to get there, and we were very late. I had been sick. I had bronchitis, and Louis, the next morning after I was married, Louis sent a bellboy down for castor oil, because I was so sick. I couldn't speak. And all he could think of was castor oil. And I, like stupid, I didn't know. I would do anything he wanted. But he sat down and got a bottle of castor oil and gave me castor oil. And I got well enough so that I could go out to dinner in the next 3 days. Can you imagine? He just knew the castor oil cured anything. So we went over to Aunt Hannah's, and she had the whole family there. They were very wealthy people, and they lived in a beautiful home. And there was Agnes Janney and young Hanita, who was living with Aunt Hannah, because her mother and father were dead, and the family. And here was this formal table, and a napkin all folded very intricately on my plate. And I was so nervous at meeting the family and being so late that when we sat down, I took the napkin to put in my lap like this, and a roll bounced out and hit on the floor and bounced around. In every napkin there was a roll. That was supposed to be high society, I guess. Since then I've heard that it isn't good taste to put rolls in the napkins. I was so covered with confusion. But anyway, Hanita, the debutante that was going with somebody up there, she was very snobbish. She asked me to show her. She said, "Oh, let me see your engagement ring." And I just had a little band of 5 diamonds, and I loved it. It was it was like a queen's crown, fairy queen's crown. And she said, "Oh, a guard." She really punctured my balloon, but I still love that ring.
What happened to her?
She had a very sad life. She, I think she had to go in a mental hospital. She had children that one child couldn't take care of it. Aunt Hannah, it was Aunt Hannah's niece, and Aunt Hannah took care of her, but she didn't have a very good life, and her husband divorced her, so it was sad, very sad. Now.
Well, how long were you on your honeymoon in New York?
Hmm?
How long were you in New York?
Not very long. We came back. Louis had to be back the 1st of January, and this was the 28th. We were married on the 28th for 9/30/31. Only had 3 days, but the castor oil did it. Did you ever hear in your life? And I was too sick to leave the room, the bedroom. I was completely laid low. And that was my honeymoon.
Well, where'd you go?
Then we came home and caught the train and went out to Fort Knox, or Camp Knox, Kentucky, on the train. So that he was there on the he had to be there on the 2nd of January. So I think we were traveling on on New Year's Day. And did you know what I lived in?
Mess hall.
Yeah. And you know how long a World War I mess hall was? You don't know how long they are? They're about a block long. So Louis, before he left Fort Knox, he made himself a nest. And he was assigned one of these mess halls. And he got the carpenters to put a partition halfway, divided in half. And down at this end was a mess hall kitchen. And it had 2 sinks that came up to here on me and were as deep as this table. So I couldn't reach the bottom of the sink. And there were 2 of them. They'd put all the mess hall dishes in them and then wash them. So there were 2 there, and then over here they had 2 stoves heated by soft coal. And I repeat, soft coal. Powder. It wasn't even hunks, it was powder. And I didn't know how to make a fire. And I was supposed to cook on that. Then he had gone someplace and gotten bathroom fixtures, and they had put in a little bathroom there, so we had an indoor bathroom. We were the only people with indoor bathroom on that whole area. Everybody else had to go to a latrine. But we had a bathroom. And it had a bathtub and a toilet and a sink, lavatory. And that was the pride of his life. He was thrilled to death to get a bathroom. Then there was another partition, and that had the center stove in it, and it was happy. It was as big as this. The furnace was that big. What's the matter?
Just checking.
It was enormous. And he had his desk in there. It was very cold at Fort Knox and very wet. We had a place, one big section was our living room and dining room. We had the great big kitchen with the double sinks and the double thing. Then we had the furnace room with his with his desk. And then the rest of it to the middle partition was bedroom. And the bedroom was as long as this house with 2 little army cots in it. That was our bedroom. And it had little windows all along. You know how a mess hall has? We had little windows all around it. And no curtains, nothing. That was where he brought me. At night he would bank the fire with the powdered coal. He was going to school, field artillery school. And in the morning, he'd had this long iron poker, a very long thing, and he would stick it in the banked coal and give it a twist like that, and it would explode. And he would be covered with soot. Time after time. Well, but we were very much in love. I had told him that I would live in a tent if he wanted me to, but I don't believe I could have lived in a tent out there.
Where did you go from Fort Knox?
Came back at the end of his school in June to my mother's and father's because I was pregnant and was going to have Eddie. And he was stationed at New Jersey, the signal school.
What, Fort Monmouth?
And so after Eddie was born in October, I think he spent the summer months at Fort Meade, and he could come in to see me. No, he didn't either. He was at station. They took the field artillery caissons and everything up to the mountains up there in Pennsylvania.
Carlisle?
No, not Carlisle. Way up in the mountains for maneuvers and things. Most beautiful mountains. And he told me how they went through Baltimore with all these horses and the caissons. And they went at a trot right through Baltimore. It must have been fascinating, really. And so, once in a while he could get down to see me. And then he was stationed at Fort Monmouth at Deal, New Jersey. He got a little apartment there, but Eddie was born, and then after Christmas, he came down for Christmas. And after Christmas, he took me back with him to Deal. And Mother Prentiss went back to help us get settled. And on the way back, stayed a night with Aunt Hannah in New Jersey. And we went up on the train, and Eddie was in a little basket with a handle. That's how I carried my baby up. Up there. And we stayed up there until May, and then he was ordered to Fort Myer. And the 16th Field Artillery, I think it was. And Catherine was born in February. We had a set of quarters over there at Fort Myer. We had the whole house. There were duplexes, you know. And I had an attic, and I had bedrooms and baths, and living room, dining room with a dumb waiter, and a big kitchen.
The whole
And
thing.
I had a whole thing and no furniture. We had no furniture. My mother went out. She helped us find some wicker furniture. This isn't being recorded.
We're just getting around television here.
Oh, well, anyway. She got us some wicker furniture, a little settee and some chairs and a little table, and then we found some dining room chairs. And Catherine was born when we were over there. She was born at Walter Reed, and we brought her back there. And then he was ordered to Panama
to the grandchildren.
You really want to go out with me?
Sure.
I don't like the food at the Chevy Chase Club, but I can.
Else.
I sure can take you there. Would you like to see the club?
Well, go ahead and have a seat.
Let's go to the club this time.
Okay.
All right.
Only if you let me pay.
No,
Well, then we go to Marriott.
All right, let's do it. Because I don't like the food at the Chevy Chase Club.
Well, have a seat.
When she comes, will you give her those clothes?
Yeah, who is this?
Ask her to come in. Sylvia Collio. She lives in this stone house.
Okay.
Right there.
All right.
And she isn't very well.
Was that right?
Listen, if there are not enough clothes there, could you run her down to the
Yeah.
down to the store?
Mm-hmm. How many clothes is she looking for?
See, I don't have very many. I don't know how much she needs. If she's having a reception, she's going to have an awful lot of clothes, I think. Let me take you to the Chevy Chase Club this time.
Oh, I'd like to take you out.
All right.
Where do you think is right?
Hmm?
I think you'd rather go out to Marriott, wouldn't
I know I would.
you? Okay. We're going to do it that way.
Will you let me pay
I'll pay.
this time?
My choice. I only get here once in a while, and I like to pay. Well, you got to tell me what happens in Fort Knox.
Oh, what happened at Fort Knox?
No, from Fort Knox. You
From Fort Knox.
or anything else at Fort Knox?
Well, except that I
How long
was
were you
very
there?
pregnant and very sick.
How long were you there?
From my wedding day, from the 1st of July, 29, to June. Well, he was going to school, you see.
Oh, that's right. And then you came back, Fort Monmouth.
And they went to Fort Monmouth, then he
and
came
then
to Fort Myer,
Yeah.
and then we went to Panama in November. There she is.
I'll get it. That's
No, that's the little dog. We went down to Panama, and I had two babies, Eddie and Catherine. And Catherine, when I left, Aunt Catherine and the others had said behind my back, she'll never raise the baby. Catherine was just, looked like she was fading away. And here I had to take this little girl down to Panama. She was born in February, and this was November. 9 months. And she was growing, and her bones were growing, but she wasn't putting on any weight. And they had her on protein milk powder because she couldn't tolerate any milk. And on the way down, ask her to come in. And say you'll take her down.
Hi. How are you? Just fine.
This is my son, Lloyd Prentiss.
Isn't that cute?
Isn't that wonderful? Talk.
Yeah.
Say hello.
Oh my word! Look at it! Look at it! I just
Isn't that nice? Isn't that lovely? Tell Dr. Tell that you're on television.
Isn't that very cute?
Isn't that fascinating? Magic. It's magic.
When would that happen?
He's taking it right here.
Oh
Right
my
here.
God, I look like a squaw.
Thank you, darling. Okay. I'm so glad I could help you. Did they have the 16th field artillery in
Mhm.
Panama?
That's right.
Well, then what did they have at Fort Myer? Was it the 6th? Going down on the transport, which was terrible. I thought, now this is the end of it. End of my little girl. And she began eating right after that. Got along just fine.
Is that right?
Yeah. Just
Yeah.
took the whooping cough
After the whooping
to
cough.
straighten her out. I don't know what happened. Now what do you want?
What part of, where, were you on the Atlantic or the Pacific?
How was it Gatun?
Got students on
That's Atlantic
the
coast.
Atlantic side.
Uh-huh, uh-huh. And at first we were in horrible quarters. And we had the most awful experience just a few days after, I guess it was the first night after they gave us these quarters. And they put army cots up there for us to use. And these buildings were made by the French at Gatun, and they were very high up on platforms. And you had to go down a long stairway to get to the ground. And Louis had gotten army blankets and everything for us to live in there. And in the middle of the night, I just felt like I didn't know what was the matter with me. I was jumping like this. Every muscle in my body was doing this. And I woke, it was raining torrents outside because it was a wet season. And I woke Louis up. I said, Louis, I don't know what's the matter with me. I think I'm having a nervous breakdown. And he jumped out of bed and he threw the covers off the bed and he said, get out of bed. And the place was alive with bedbugs.
Oh, is that right?
Alive with bedbugs. They had sent, the army had sent up army cots with coil springs that had never been treated with a blowtorch. And the webs in the springs were a mess of bedbugs. And that's what they gave Louis to put his family in. To me, it was the most, to me, I can't tell you how I feel to this day
I bet.
to have been treated like that. And he threw the army blankets right out in the rain, and I slept on the floor. And he called up the next day, and they came up right away and took the cuts out. I thought it was a cruel, cruel thing to do to anybody. And they had to go over the cuts with a blowtorch and just treat them red hot in order to clean
Kill
them up.
Right.
Clean them up. And I stayed in that apartment. Are you all ready now?
I'm all ready.
Okay, now.
You on television?
Yeah, come on in here.
Come on.
Let's get Albert on the television. Come here a minute.
Come here, Albert.
Come here.
How's this?
Oh, come on. Can you see? There you are.
Oh,
Yeah.
isn't that wonderful? Isn't
Isn't that terrific?
We can get
you
both-
look great on television.
We'll get you both on there.
Yeah.
There.
Oh,
Isn't
that's
that-
wonderful.
And now we can zoom right on in. See, we can get real good close up.
Oh,
Isn't that nice?
that's nice. That's wonderful.
Mrs. Collio came in and she saw us. She didn't know where it was coming from.
Oh. You want me to come until tomorrow?
Well, why don't you give me Friday instead?
All right. Okay.
Now you'll come Thursday.
Thursday.
You'll come miss Wednesday and come Thursday and Friday.
All right.
All right, I'll see you now. Thanks so much.
Nice meeting you.
Yeah.
Right.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye. Oh, Alberta, here, take this. These are goose livers. Put them in the deep freeze out there in the garage. I think this is bread, yeah. So, here, I don't want that. What's the matter with you?
There, you're getting there.
Yeah, that's better. So, that was my introduction to Panama. And then my mother, I was so frightened about Catherine, and her February was coming up, and my mother said, come up to California, let's get the baby back on the track. And so Louis got me passage on an Army transport. Took me up to California. And up there, that was in March, April, I couldn't get back to Panama because every time they'd get me a passage on a transport, and we didn't have any money. I think he was making all of $140 a month. He was the second lieutenant. And every time I would get passage to go back to him, some congressman would take it to go down on. And finally, it looked, Father Prentiss and my father began to think that maybe it was dangerous for me to be that separated from Louis that long, because it was August, from February until August. And so my father wrote to Father Prentiss, and Father Prentiss pulled some strings, and they got me passage on a mailboat. And I didn't know what a mailboat was, and my father didn't know what a mailboat, at least he didn't tell me he knew what a mailboat was. But he was determined to get me back to Louis for fear I wouldn't, you know, there'd be a separation, too long a separation, and we might not hit it off. So, my mother didn't go down with me, but my father took me and Eddie and Catherine down to the docks in San Francisco, and here was this mailboat, and happy it was no longer than a ferry boat. It had a main dining room downstairs in the open part of the boat. Then it had 1, 2, 3, 4 cabins on one side and 4 cabins on another side, and the captain had his quarters up above us. And then on the back where the crew were, and the the decks, and one bathroom right off of the dining salon. And that was the boat that was going to take me to Panama. And they gave me a room up under the captain's quarters on the front of the boat, on the left-hand side. And it had 2 bunks and a little settee, just a little settee built against the wall. And I put Catherine on the settee, and I put Eddie, or maybe it was vice versa, I don't know. And I slept on the upper bunk because I was afraid they'd fall out. And we started out, and we stopped at every port from San Francisco to Panama, every single port. I was in Managua, I was in Corinto, I was in every one of those Central American ports. And what they would do, there was no, they didn't have any real railings on the deck. They just had ropes, so that I had to hang on to my children when we were out there all the time. And if they left any toys on the deck, if the boat went this way, the toys went right out. And it was so hot that you couldn't walk on the decks in the daytime. And no awnings, nothing. So they would travel by night and anchor outside of one of these places and send the boats in, and they'd stay out there all day without moving and then move at night. And that's the way we went down to Panama. And every time we left, I would write a letter to Louis. I'd say, fly up here and get me out. I can't stand it. I can't stand it. And I never got a letter. And it took me 28 days to get to Panama with 2 babies. And in the daytime, the people that would come, the officials from the land would come out in a boat and swarm over the place, and if there were any toys of the children or anything there, they just would put them in their pockets right away. You had to hurry and put, I lost all the toys going down. And one night, I haven't told this to many people, but I told it to Louis, and I've told it to some of them. It was after we left Corinto. Oh, I'm going back a little bit further. I was the only woman on the boat until they picked up a prostitute at one of these places and brought her on. And the men had a party that night, and I was in my room, my bed, bunk, what do you call it, cabin, and it was so hot, and the fan was like, here is my bunk like this, and the fan was right up there. It's a very small bunk. And I was practically stripped because of the heat. And suddenly I realized that the fan was off. And I turned, and here was a man right at my bunk. And I covered myself up. What are you doing in here? And he said, well, your fan was off. He had turned it off. They were all these people were in the other cabin drinking. How I ever got that man out, I don't know. But he was up to no good. So when we got to Corinto, the purser asked me to go ashore with him to see the place and have dinner. So I went with him and took the 2 children, and we drove around, but I was so nervous that pretty soon he brought me back. I think that happened before this man entered I think it was a purser that entered my room, my cabin. But anyway, the next stop, they took on a woman and a man, and they were well-to-do. And in the morning, they would tell me that I couldn't use the bathroom until he was through, because he would carry his wife down to the bathroom and lock the door, and then take care of her, bathe her and take care of her, and then carry her back to her cabin. And on the second or the third day, I missed Eddie, and I went out on the corridor, and I saw all these people down there, and he was down there with them. He was just a little boy, 4 years old, and he was standing there. This woman had died. They had her on a plank. They had wrapped her all around to hold her on the plank. What's the matter?
Oh, that's okay.
Then I grabbed Eddie and took him back to the cabin, and then I went out on the deck and watched, and they took this plank with a hook on it, and they lowered her like that way down onto a lighter, little boat, and took her ashore. But Eddie was taking it all in, watching everything. Well, I got to Panama, and Louis got on the boat. Was I ever glad to see that man? Wasn't that an experience?
Yeah.
Wasn't that a terrible experience? I don't know how I lived through it. I swear, I don't
Good
see
now.
how I could do it, huh?
You can't do it now.
It's just because I was young. I had enough to get me over. And it was then, soon after that Father Prentiss died. That was in February. No, it wasn't either. I stayed there, I was down there 3 years in Panama. And the last year, in February, Father Prentiss died, and Mother Prentiss wanted Louis. So Louis left me down there. We had been moved into French quarters, very nice place to live. A little individual home, and we were comfortable. And it overlooked Gatun Lake, and there would be great big alligators lying on the banks right down below us. And your father would go out there with his shotgun or his pistol, and he'd take aim and he would fire at these things. He came home for lunch every day, and they would slither into the water. I don't know whether he hit them or not, but he was a pretty good shot. But I don't think they penetrated. And so after his father died, he went up to help his mother straighten out her estate. Oh, I have to go back a little bit. We had gone up to San Francisco to spend Christmas with my family, and Louis was looking so badly that they thought he ought to have a rest. So he and the 2 children and I were given passage on a Navy transport, and that was deluxe. They treated us like royalty. It's the first time in the service that anybody ever treated us with that much deference, as though he were a colonel and he was a second lieutenant. But they had stopped in Guantanamo, and they had avocados as big as that. And they would send them up to my room. Avocados. It was wonderful. The children had their own little dining room, and they had their mess attendants to feed them and take care of them. I didn't have to do anything. It was luxury. I just loved the Navy. So we got up to San Francisco, and we had Christmas. When we got up there, Suzanne was sick. And they didn't know what was the matter with her. Are you listening to me or not? Well, sit down. And when we left there, and they put us back on an army transport to go back, because Louis was with me and they had to send him back to duty. We were just going, I was telling the family goodbye and all, and we had put Eddie in his bunk. We had a private room, and we were going out the Golden Gate, and I went down to see about Eddie, and he was so seasick. He had exploded, and I said, "Oh, Eddie, what happened?" And he said, "Mother, it was just something I couldn't handle." It was just something I couldn't handle. Well, we were getting the riptide out there, and he was so sick because he was going every which way, and he was down under the deck, down on the lower deck. If I'd only had him up on the upper deck with me, I don't think he would have been sick. Maybe he'd been sicker. Who knows? Anyway, we got back to Panama, and then as soon as we got back there in about February, Father Prentiss died, and he had to leave me. As soon as he left me, both my children got awful sick, and I didn't know what was the matter. And Eddie was delirious, and I was frantic, and I called Captain Chamberlain, and he was quite angry with me, and he said I was just an hysterical mother. And he made me, he really browbeat me. The idea of calling him and telling me my child was sick when it was nothing but the flu. Well, as soon as the fever went down with that little boy, and I dressed him and got him up, he kept falling down. And I got him outside, and he had his little tricycle, but every time he tried to walk, he'd fall. And a neighbor came by, because she knew I was alone, and it was a colonel's wife. And I said, I don't know what's the matter with Eddie, but he can't walk and he keeps falling down. And she looked at me, and she turned and went right home. Didn't even say goodbye. And pretty soon, Captain Chamberlain came to me, to the house with some other doctors. And I said, I don't know what's the matter with my little boy. He can't walk. He keeps falling. They didn't say what was the matter or anything. They just took my child away from me. Really, I think the Army was the most cruel outfit. They did the most cruel things to their people. They told me that I had to be in isolation. They took Catherine too. They took both children away. Put them in Ancon Hospital on the Pacific side, the one big Army hospital. Put them in Ancon. And here I was. Nobody could get near me. I was in isolation. So this friend of Father Prentiss's and my father's, who had played golf out there with Louis, he was a dear man. He had his son was the head of the canal post exchange and commissary and everything. And I called him up, and he said, come right over to us. So I went over to him, and then I found out, then I was told that my children had polio. And they had taken, when they went into Ancon, they had taken spinal taps. They discovered that Catherine had it, but she wasn't paralyzed. But Eddie was paralyzed on the right side. And after a while, the residual, the paralysis left his leg, and finally just centered in the deltoid up here in the shoulder. But at first he was paralyzed on the whole side of him. And so I stayed with what in the world are these people named? Dear people. And every time I was allowed, I would go over to Ancon to see the children, and they wouldn't let them touch me. They wouldn't let me touch them. And they had Eddie on one side of the corridor and Catherine on the other, two babies. They were really babies. And one time, Eddie took all of his toys, and he climbed over the fence, the little gate, and took all of his toys to Catherine, to be with Catherine. And the nurses found him, and they were angry with him. And they took him back, and they said that if he did that again, that he couldn't see his mother.
It's sad.
Oh, it's terrible. So I was weeping all the time.
And Pop was still up in Washington?
Yeah, and they wouldn't tell him. They didn't want to tell him because he had to stay with his mother. And so it came time. They were in quarantine 28 days. And he was gone all that time, a whole month. And finally, he came back on a boat. And the doctors would not let me meet him. They wouldn't let me go down to meet him. I was back in my home by that time, but the children were not home. They were still in the hospital. And when he docked and they talked to him. They said that his children were paralyzed. One child was paralyzed. They'd had polio. They had picked it up from Suzanne in California. She had polio, and it had developed in Panama, and they were the only cases in Panama. They'd never had any cases there. And so he was absolutely wild. But he hadn't been told. And so they did everything they could to help us from then on, and got us transferred right to Walter Reed, Fort Myer, so that we could be near Walter Reed. And by that time we had Eddie back and Catherine, but nobody would go near us. They were so afraid of us. And so we came up here, and I suddenly realized that was that was in May, that I was pregnant with you. I guess it was April, because I'm mixed up with the times, but anyway, it was April, and we got it back up here in May, and I didn't know I was pregnant until May. That was it. And so I was so sick I couldn't take Eddie out to Walter Reed, so that was when Miss Naylor, who was head of the special services that would help the people in the Army that needed help, she had a car, and she was always in a uniform. She was a lovely Charlotte Naylor. And she would take Eddie out to Walter Reed for treatments. And when she was going out 16th Street one time, they were building some houses out there, and they had a little doll's house, just big enough for an office, a desk, and a chair, and made it look like a little cottage with a little front porch, and Miss Naylor said, Eddie, he was 5 years old then, or coming up 5. Wouldn't you just love to live in that little house? And he said, no, it looks just like my grandmother's toilet. Looked like the outhouse. Just like my grandmother's toilet. Oh dear. So then they decided that nothing could be done about that shoulder, and they had him in an airplane splint that fitted around his body, and held his arm up, hoping that the nerve would grow back, but it wouldn't. So we spent the time at Walter Reed, at Fort Myer, until Happy was born. You. Yeah, I forgot I was talking to you. And you were born on Christmas night. And after that, your father decided that he was not cut out to groom horses, that he was an engineer by profession, and he wanted to get back into engineers. So he asked for a transfer to the Corps of Engineers, and they transferred him. And we went down to Fort Humphreys. And I just loved it down there. And you were the cutest little boy I ever saw in my life down there. I would bundle you all up on a winter morning, your stocking cap and your muffler, and you just looked just like a square. You were that chunky. And I would watch you. I'd open the door and start you out on the porch. I think you were all of 3, or maybe 2.5. And you'd stand on that little front porch, and you'd look the whole world over. You'd look everywhere, and then you'd start out, and you'd make the rounds all around. And when I put Pete out, and he stands on the porch, and he looks all around, and I think of you every time he does it.
Well,
That's it.
that's it for now. What we're going to do, we're going to talk about Fort Humphreys, which used to be
Yeah.
the name for Fort Belvoir,
Yeah.
which is
It started out as Camp Humphreys. The engineers were stationed at Fort McNair first, and then they were moved out. Are we recording now?
yeah, we're recording right now.
They were moved out to Camp Humphreys, and that was during the First World War. And they had these wartime construction buildings down there, and for our living quarters they would take 2 mess halls and put them together to make an L. The most desirable were the ones with an L. The ones that with maybe just 2 people in them would have a single
Right.
building, the way you did when you went back there years later. And so because we had 3 children, and Lou had transferred to the Corps of Engineers and sent him down there for his basic training in engineering, or whatever you call it.
Right.
Uh,
Basic course.
what?
The basic
He
course.
he went to school there
Right.
as a young engineer. Then we were after living at Fort Myer in a living room and a dining room and a kitchen, because that's the quarters we had at Fort Myer. We suddenly had a bedroom for everybody. It was delicious, absolutely delicious. And all this country to roam around in. And one time, your father brought home, they had cleaned up the dump. I think he had the job of cleaning up the dump because he was, let me try to think of the number of jobs he had.
Oh, he was a signal officer?
He had everything that nobody wanted,
Yeah.
including the dog catcher. So I think he had to supervise the cleaning up of the dump down there. And we had, at the end of our little, the kitchen and the back entrance, we had a little area that had the stove that heated our whole house, and it was, it burned coal. So we had the coal bins out there, and he came home one time and brought home, he came home and, well, let me think, what happened? Oh, he was on guard duty one night, and he had put a lot of winter pears in baskets that some farmer had given him, and he covered them up and with newspapers. And he was on guard duty one night, and he was out all night, and he came in about 4 o'clock in the morning, and he heard a lot of rustling. So he turned his flashlight on around this little area that had the stove and the coal bins, and here were all kinds of eyes looking at him, being reflected from the flashlight. And so he turned on the light, and he found that he had put, I forgot to tell you, he'd found a rat somewhere or other. So he had gotten some rat traps and put them on top of the pears, that was it. And when he came in the next day and flashed the light down there, all these things were in this great big rat trap. Or maybe there were 2 or 1, I can't remember, maybe 1. And he had something like 6 rats in there. So I was sleeping, I didn't know anything about it. So he took them into the kitchen, and we had 2 laundry tubs that were very deep, and he filled them. I don't know whether it was cold water or hot water. I hope it wasn't hot water, but what difference? And he just lowered the traps down in this water, drowned them. And I hope it was cold water. And so he emptied the rats you see, the rats had, when they cleaned out the dump, the rats came into the different quarters, living quarters. So he had to go out the next night. I think he was on guard duty every night for about a week, and so he put the trap back on top of that thing, and the next night he got even more. So I don't know how many times he did it, but we didn't have any rats after that, but they liked to pay us. Well, now what should we talk
I
about?
want to talk about the horses and the polo and
Well,
all those.
when Pop was a mounted officer in the field artillery at Fort Myer, he played polo. And the polo fields were right behind the quarters there at Fort Myer, so that I could go out the back along the fence. All the women, the wives, would sit there and watch the polo games in the afternoon. So when he was sent down to Fort Humphreys, they had horses down there, and he had his own horse. And they played polo down there, and they'd play visiting teams that would come down. And one time, the post doctor, Colonel, can't remember his name, came to the house about 5 o'clock or 5:30, almost dinner time, and said, "Was Louis there?" And I said, "No, he hasn't come in." And he said, "Well, when he does come in, watch him very carefully, because he's had an accident." One of the men swung his mallet and hit him in the head and knocked him off his horse. And when he got back up on his horse, he began playing for the wrong goal, and he didn't know where he was. He was disoriented. And we don't know where he is. Well, I had a terrible feeling. I knew he'd been hurt badly, but here he was off on his own somewhere and didn't know where he was. So I think somebody found him and brought him home, and he'd had a concussion. So they kept him quiet for a while, and he got all right as far as we knew. But it was much later in life, when he was in his 60s, they was beginning to have such bad headaches that they thought he might have a tumor on the brain or something. So they operated on him. And when I went out, the doctor, after the operation, and it was a pretty severe operation, the doctor called me and said he wanted my son to come out with me. He wanted to talk to us. And you came out from Fort Belvoir and drove out with me, and we had no idea what he was going to tell us, but we thought it was the worst. If he wanted my son with me when he told me the news, I was pretty sure it was going to be bad news. And we went into his office and sat there, and he said, "Mrs. Prentiss, I'm awfully sorry to tell you, but we didn't find anything wrong with your your husband's brain." And when we went into, I took this piece of his skull away from over his left eye, right eye. We found he just had adhesions from a former injury, and that was the blow that he'd gotten from the mallet, the polo mallet. And I was so mad, I didn't know what to do. I don't know what Happy thought. He didn't say anything, but I thought that was one of the most stupid things to do to a person that I've ever heard of in my life. To have my son come out with me to tell me the news that there wasn't anything wrong with my husband. And all that time I thought he was probably had cancer. Didn't you?
Yeah, well,
I did.
the doctor was really sorry because
He was so sorry because he operated on him, but there wasn't anything wrong with him.
yeah, and he was, of course, Pop was having those headaches.
Terrible headache. And
Yeah.
it was nothing in the world except that Pop, when we bought the cottage, we had some guests down there from the American Road Builders, and he took them down, took this man swimming down there, and he rode in on the waves, and he got rolled. And he got sand up his nose, and he got sand in his sinuses. And after that, he was having such severe headaches. But they sent him out to the, what is this?
Bethesda Institute.
What?
Out at Bethesda today.
Yeah, the Bethesda Institute, a health institute, because Walter Reed didn't know what was the matter. And they said, there's a shadow. When they took the picture, there's a shadow there. They took all kinds of tests. They did this, one of these, what?
Encephalogram.
Yes. So, so he was very sorry to tell me that my husband was all right.
Yeah. and couldn't find the cause for the headaches.
No.
And then Al Welling came in.
What?
Al Welling came in.
Yeah, Al Welling came. They all came in to see him.
I mean, when we were seeing a doctor, remember that?
No, I didn't know Al Welling came
He
in.
walked right in when the doctor was talking to you and me.
Oh, is that right?
Yeah, he was a commissioner. And he just walked in the doctor's office. I thought that was
I thought that was an awful dumb thing too.
just walked in.
Yeah,
He wanted to find out too.
He wanted to find out.
He was concerned, but he was that kind of a guy, Welling.
yeah.
That he was really very insensitive to a lot of things. But it's sort of
yeah.
strange.
I know it. I hate to be racist, but
Yeah.
that's what he was. I mean, he just didn't think the way I would think.
You know, down at Fort Humphreys, the first thing I can remember in my life was at Fort Humphreys. And that was sitting on the front porch, which you had a glider. There was a
Yeah.
glider there.
Yeah.
And Uncle Ernest was there. And I was swinging on this glider, and I wanted him to see me. And I knew he could see me, but he wouldn't pay any attention to me. And of course, he was deaf. And I would swing, and I kept calling to him to watch me. And he would never turn around. He would never observe. And that's the first thing I can remember of my life.
You were 4 years old.
I think I was younger than that. Because
You could have been.
when did we leave Fort Humphreys? Went out to Colorado.
Wasn't it in 31?
It was early 31.
Well, you were 4.
No, I was born in December.
27.
December 27, so I was January of 28, really.
Uh-huh.
So I think I was no older than 3, just 3.
Well, it's hard to find people that can remember that far back in their lives. They usually say it's around 5 or 6 that you remember things. But I know I can remember. I can remember at Galveston walking on the beach with my father, and he had a cane, and he would take his cane down in the sand, make a hole, and drop a penny in it. And then he would say, "Now you find the penny." And I would dig and dig and dig, and then I'd find the penny. He didn't go too far for me. I was just a little girl.
What year was that?
But you see, well, that was the year before Margaret was born, and I was 4.
About 1902?
No, I was born in 98, and 101, 102, 102, 1902.
Well, how did we go from Humphreys?
Well, we had a little Model T Ford.
Didn't you, I thought you had a Cord.
A Cord? Well, maybe.
Didn't you get the Cord from Admiral Byrd?
Well, yes, but we had to sell that because if he went over 25 miles an hour, it began to go from side to side.
When did you get that Cord?
He bought it secondhand, and the steering gear was all wrapped by Admiral Byrd, a very nautical steering wheel
Knots?
with knots all around this thing. And if we had only saved that steering gear, we could have put it in the museum.
If you could save the Cord, you would have been able to
Yeah,
put it in the museum.
sure. If only but we didn't know that it had any value.
Well, when did you get that
We
Cord?
got that at Humphreys.
At Humphreys or
Yeah.
at Meyer?
And then we had an Essex down there. No, we had the Model T Ford at Fort Myer. Then he began to get a little larger car, and I thought that we went out to Golden, Colorado in a Ford.
Probably did.
I'm sure we did. Because we went cross country in that little Ford with our children. And when we got out to Golden, Eddie had the most awful, I didn't know it at the time, but it was asthma from the driving out there with the ragweed and all. And so when we arrived there, we had to get antiphagistine for his chest and spread all that stuff over on his back, and well, he got over that. And your father could hardly wait to get us in the car and take us up Lookout Mountain. And we had such a nice house there, a beautiful house. And we were right at the foot of Lookout Mountain. And Guggenheim Hall was right across from us. And every time we'd make a bend, we'd get higher, and we'd be close to the edge. Catherine would make a squeal. She couldn't stand it. We were getting so high. And your father said, "Don't do that again. Don't do that anymore." So she sat there, and every time she'd go around this bend, she'd go, whew. Then we'd go around another one, whew. We went up the mountain with Catherine said, whew. Poor little girl. And it was worse coming down the mountain.
Did she go all the way down?
She went
too?
down all the mountain, but she didn't squeal anymore. Oh dear. And we had a barn at the back of our house, and it had the doors that would open where they had put hay for the, I guess, bales of hay up there, and a pulley to pull them up there. And we had, by that time, we had Arlie that was a cross, a Cherokee Indian, and an Irish father.
Where'd she come from?
She came from Oklahoma.
Yeah, but how'd you happen to get her out in Colorado?
Somebody called me and said, we've got to, the Depression had set in by that time, and nobody had any money. Nobody could buy anything. The banks had closed. We had paid our rent by check, and Mr. whatever his name was that owned the house had failed to cash the check when the money was in the bank. So the bank closed, and here he was holding the check, and they wouldn't give him any money. So, fortunately, the Army was kept being paid, but at a lower rate. They had cut our pay. Am I talking too loud?
Oh, fine.
So Pop had to pay a second time, but I don't believe he paid actually twice, because I think he destroyed the first check. I hope he did, because we didn't have any money either. But anyway, Arlie came to us as a live-in maid, and she had never worn shoes. And she was as Indian looking as you can imagine, but a strong, fine looking woman. And she just loved my children, and she helped me very much, and she learned very quickly. And she was left in charge of you children when we went over to Fort Logan for something in the afternoon. And when we came back, she said, there's something wrong with Happy. The children were playing out in the barn, and they told Happy to hold on to this rope while they pulled him up to the hayloft. And so he got almost up there, and then he let go, and he fell down. Well, you had a concussion yourself. Fortunately, it didn't last too long, but Eddie was pulling you up by this rope, and you let go. He was going to pull you into the hayloft. Oh, dear me. And then April Fool's Day came along, and you all knew it was the 1st of April, and you never trusted your father, and you had a little room right at the end of our bedroom by yourself, and Eddie had a front bedroom, and Catherine had a back one, and Arlie had her own room. We all had bedrooms. It was wonderful to spread out. And Louis looked out the window, and the Mines football team had brought in some little burros, and I think they had a polo game out, and they were riding burros around. Well, during the night, one of them got off the tether that they had down there near the field, and he came up to our yard, and we had quite a large yard. And Pop said, "Happy, look out the window. There's a little donkey out here." And Happy said, "Oh, I know, April Fool. Can't fool me. Happy, come here and look, there's a little donkey out here." "Uh-uh. No, sir. I know you." "Happy, you better look." And you couldn't hold it in any longer. You really had to go and peek out the window, and there was a little donkey. So your father went in to Eddie, and Catherine woke them up and said, "Look out the window, there's a donkey out here." "I can't fool us." Nobody would look out the window. And even Ollie wouldn't look out the window. And when they did that, they couldn't believe their eyes. We had a donkey. It was adorable. Now let's see, what else happened out there? Oh, we went skiing, but there wasn't enough snow. And I can remember seeing your father going down this slope, and there were boulders all around, but it was snow. He hit one of these rocks, and he went head first right straight on down the mountain. Not too far, but at least he left his skis behind. But there wasn't any snow to make a track.
Yeah. Well, I remember when they used to have initiations there of the fraternities,
Yeah.
and then they used to have
Can you be heard on this?
oh yeah, and then they used to have a day in which the freshmen used to get even with the upperclassmen and throw eggs
And what did they do?
threw eggs at them, and
Threw eggs?
oh, and
I
they-
didn't see any
They
of
had
that.
tug of war in the mud.
Well, I knew they had tug of war, but
It was a whole day.
I didn't see it. But you saw
It was the same day that they would go up and paint the M on the mountain,
it.
whitewash the M.
Yeah. And the opposing team, some other college would come up to try to stop them, and they'd
Right.
have a battle up on the mountainside. And then you used to go over to Guggenheim Hall and sit on the ledge of the basement windows. And down below they had some classrooms in what do you call
Geology.
geology. And all the students thought you were pretty cute. And you were only 5, and you had a little wagon.
Second reel of the of this tape. There's two reels of tape that we've taken here. And we're just talking about right now Golden, Colorado.
Golden, Colorado.
Right.
When your father was PMS&T, is that what you call it?
Yeah.
He was the PMS&T officer in
R-
charge of
ROTC.
ROTC.
Right.
So you were going over every morning when they had classes down in the basement of Guggenheim Hall, and sit out on the stone coping and look in at the students, and you were their mascot because they thought you were pretty cute. And then somebody would hand you a rock because you were collecting stones. You had a collection of stones. So they were handing you specimens that were down there in the classroom. And you would put the rock in your little red wagon and bring it home for your collection. And then the next morning you'd go over there and somebody'd give you another specimen. You had very nice collection. geological.
I understand. I used to participate in the questions as to what the various minerals were. From
Yes,
the professor.
You knew what galena was, and you knew what the names of some of these things that I didn't know anything about. But one day, the professor came to your father and said, "I think that my students have been giving your little son our specimens, and we'd have to have them back." So Pop didn't know anything about it, neither did I. So we had to collect all these very good specimens and give them back to the professor. So we stopped collecting stones there. But I think they gave you some agate that you could keep for yourself, and I think you still have it. And after was there anything else?
Well, what about
Anything else in
what
Golden?
About, what about Eddie and Catherine there in Golden? What were
Well,
some of the things that they were doing?
behind our house, we had clay pits. The Coors people made very good pottery out there, and they got their clay from the pits that were beyond our house, and they were narrow trenches wide enough to leap across and get to the other side, but just able to. They were very dangerous. And that was off limits to all you children. You could not go over where the clay pits were, because it was just a maze of them. And they were very deep. And I came back, Pop and I guess I came back alone. And I found that you and Happy, I don't think Catherine was there, had been out there jumping over the clay pits. And so I took a little switch and I switched your legs. And from that time on, they always told me, would bring it up to me, how I had brutalized you.
Horsewhipped us.
What? I horsewhipped you. It was a little lariat that I had. It was given to me as a child, and it went with a pony cart, a real pony cart. And it was a little rattan switch, and it had little knots in it, all down. So instead of a switch from a tree, I had that little lariat, and I used it on your legs because I had to impress on you the fact that you could never go over in the clay pits. But you never let me forget it. You never let me forget that I horsewhipped you. I just beat you up. And it just killed me. Arlie didn't like it either. She didn't like me using that little switch on you. But you never went back to the clay pits again.
Whatever happened to the little switch?
We were going out to Fort Mason?
Where? Fort Scott?
Fort Scott. Mason was down the Presidio one. Mm-hmm. We were going out in our Ford, and Arlie was in the Ford with us. We went out with Maud Gates in one car, and I had the little switch with me, and Arlie didn't like that switch. And along the road to California, she threw it out the window, and that's where my little lariat went. And it was a beautiful little handmade lariat. So when we got out there at Fort Scott, and Louis was aide to General Cheney, we had such nice quarters. And you were in kindergarten, so you had all the afternoon off, and everybody else, except a couple of your friends, all the other children were in school. And one day, we had a row of garages behind us, and everybody had his own garage and his own padlock. And that day, you and your friends I don't know whether there were 2 or 3 of you or 4, but you went along and you collected all the padlocks that were just hanging on the door. The cars were out. The men, officers had gone to work. But you took all the padlocks off and had them in a basket or a bag. And then you went back and closed the doors and hooked the padlocks on the doors. But you didn't remember which padlocks went to which doors. And that afternoon, after work, the men came back and nobody could get in their garages. And they were ready to, they were all steamed up. Nobody could get their cars in the garage. They didn't know what had happened. So that night, at midnight, the chaplain came in. He was the only one that hadn't gone over to the office to try to find out what key went to what padlock. Because everybody had to go over and turn in their keys, go over there and turn in the keys, and then they had to sort out the keys. But the chaplain came in at midnight, and it was deep fog. The fog had rolled in, and he couldn't open his garage, and he was steaming hot. I don't know what he did until daylight, but he didn't get in his garage. But I think you were given they called all you little boys. How many of them were there? Do you remember? You don't remember this? They called you all over to the office and lined you up, and they really read the law out to you. They didn't do anything else to you, but they really told you off. You didn't try to do it. You were just collecting padlocks. And then when you were through, you hung them back on the doors. But you didn't do it intentionally to lock out the officers, but you really did cause havoc.
Well, there's another story about those garages there.
Yes, you had to break
president.
some windows if you wanted to belong
Eddie was
to a
president.
certain club.
Eddie was president of the club, and Catherine was vice president.
And the more windows you broke, the higher up you were in the organization. And I don't know, one of them had 27 windows because they were small panes, but they called a little pane a window. But I think there were 27 that they broke. That was an initiation into this club. And you broke quite a few yourself.
Well, Eddie broke the most because he was president.
What?
Eddie broke the most.
Yeah, Eddie broke the most. 20. He broke the most.
And Catherine broke the less because she was vice president.
I think so. And then one time, Arlie was living with us. She went back there with us. We had gone in town, and something upset Eddie very badly. He was very mad at you. You and Eddie had the room together, and he threatened to jump out the window. Do you remember that?
Yep.
And he got halfway out the window, or all the way out. Catherine said he got all the way out and was hanging on by his hands when Arlie came down and got him in. And that was... But I think that Eddie was smarter than that. I think he had his arms pretty well inside the house so that he wasn't going to let go. But I know that Catherine nearly had heart failure. Do you remember that?
Yeah, I remember.
Do you remember how, were you frightened?
Well, he was hanging there by his hands.
I know it. Well, they told us about it when we got home. And let's see what else happened out there.
Well, Arlie left then.
Well, Arlie was so good by that time that a bachelor dentist got her away from me, offered her so much money as a housekeeper that I couldn't keep her any longer. And I understood her desire to better herself. but it certainly killed me to lose Arlie. And she was very sad about leaving too. But Arlie went and kept house for this dentist. And then Arlie married one of the sergeants there, which was quite a step up for somebody who had never worn shoes when they came to me. And so she had a home of her own by that time, and they were transferred to Panama, and I got a letter from her, and she'd had a baby, and she named the baby Helen. And I thought that was such a nice thing to have a baby named for myself.
Did you ever hear from her?
Yes, I heard after Eddie died, she wrote me a letter, and she was very illiterate. It was, I can't tell you how illiterate her writing was. You didn't notice so much when she talked, but when she tried to write, she could not write grammatically. But she wanted, she was grieving for Eddie. So it was very sweet of her to write me. And then after that, I never heard any more. Because I went to Germany and things, I don't know what happened to Arlie. But she was certainly a wonderful woman, really a wonderful woman. And she dearly loved you children. So then from Fort Scott, can you think of anything that you did at Fort Scott that was interesting?
Well, I remember Eddie
We used to go over to my mother's in
Yeah.
Berkeley, and my mother and father's, and they would come to us at Christmas time. Well, what you remember? What, Eddie?
He had a magazine route.
Oh,
He used to sell.
I think it was
Saturday
Saturday
Evening
New Post.
Yeah.
Eddie would deliver all right, but he would never collect. He just would not collect the money. He couldn't get anybody to pay him for his magazines, and your father would have to go around with him. And what else?
I used to go around with him.
And you,
Deliver.
and by that time we had Duke, the red setter.
Where'd you come from?
He came from the neighbors right next door who were transferred, and they didn't have any place to take. What was that setter's name?
Duke.
Duke. So they asked us if we wanted Duke, and we did. We took Duke, and he was so sweet. He was just lovely. We had a cat too, and the cat was named Farina. And the way we got Farina was you caught a serious cold, and it left you with rheumatic fever. You had a rheumatic heart. And the doctor said that you had to stay for I don't know how many months it was, or weeks, in your room, on your bed. Keep him as quiet as we could. So my mother said, I'm going to get Happy a kitten. I know a person who has a cat that has really beautiful kittens. So I went over to Berkeley and I got this little black kitten, little male kitten, and we called him Farina, after the little boy in our gang. And that cat stayed with you night and day in your room, and you tumbled with it, you wrestled with it, and it just adored you. And you would roll over and over with the cat in your arms on your bed. You played with it all day, and he just adored you. When your father came home at lunchtime, he would meet your father at the door. He had gotten large by that time. And he would stretch his paws up as high on your father's knees, legs, as he could, and your father would pick him up and put him like a lady's stole around his shoulders and the back, and then go all around the house with him, and he just loved your father. And at night, when he was a kitten, before he was that big, and you would have your bath at night, he would get up on the side of the bathtub, and do you want me to tell you this?
Yeah.
And with the water running, he would dip down and play with the water with his paw. And then you would watch, and I don't know whether you helped him, but pretty soon he would fall into the tub, and then you'd think that was the greatest joke on earth. Farina in the bathtub. And then one time, in order to get onto the bathtub edge, he had to jump onto the toilet seat, and the top was down, and then from the toilet seat he would step over onto the edge of the bathtub. So one time you didn't put the top down on the toilet, and he wanted to get up to the bathtub. You were in the bath water, and he jumped right in the toilet. And that was another joke. That was an awful funny joke. Farina in the toilet. Now what else?
Well, we left.
Oh, you were in kindergarten, and you were Pocahontas. You were Hiawatha, and I have pictures of you as Hiawatha because you were the star with your Indian feathers and all. And you had to sing a little song about Wah-wah-tassie, little firefly. Do you remember that?
Let me light you with my candle.
Oh, that was delicious. I thought that was out with me.
Sure.
I don't like the food.